reality.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So sorry, what's the time expected at this hotel? 5 minutes.
What James said. Yeah, I think 5 minutes intro for each of the people in.
The people are leaving.
Trying to give us space
They're
for
not coming.
whatever it is.
Well, I hope people come.
Yeah.
Do it to
I think for us, it would be more interesting to sit around the table and have a structured debate. The thing with these panels is it's always, we have 10 minutes. It's always
Where are you based?
a bit short.
UK. Okay.
We cannot really go deep in any question. Just call out a few messages.
everybody phones off
Repeat them at
I
me.
just left mine over there just to be
Something sticks.
just to.
kill the possibilities. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We'd just like to crave your indulgence for a few moments here. If you'd be kind enough to just move to the center of the auditorium, it will be very much appreciated. We really have a wonderful, fascinating panel that's about to begin right now, and I think your presence close up front will be a great encouragement to them. Thank you very much for your cooperation. If we could do that over the next few moments, that would be very, very much appreciated. Thank you.
In here.
Out there as well.
I don't know if this is it. Should we start?
I think so. Yeah, we should just go for it.
Mr. So you work with Lillian as well then? Lillian Bernard. Is there Lillian?
Thomas, tell me when you think we should start. Are there people still outside coming in, or should we get?
Let's just start.
Okay.
I think we should start.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think we're going to get started, and others will kind of trickle in uh, as and when they do. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here this afternoon. Thank you for your time and for your interest in the African tech revolution. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun here today, in addition to an inspiring talk by a group of eminent and very passionate and successful tech entrepreneurs and tech financiers across the continent. My name is James French. I'm here as representing the University of Virginia's Darden Business School. I'm an advisor to the school. And the University of Virginia's, the Darden School is very interested in engaging with Africa in terms of countries and companies more strategically and more extensively, and I'm advising them on how best to do that, as there's not enough, I would say, of the leading business schools in the world. There are not enough of them focusing on the continent, and as all of you know, Africa's rise is right around the corner, and we want to be part of that. I'm an advisor, which means that I also do other things, and I'm also a tech entrepreneur myself, and I work in the fintech space, developing a platform using big data to support SMEs in Africa. So I'm going to introduce the panel. First, I would like to thank the Minister of Science and Technology, Kinsani Kubai Gubane, for joining us today. I'm honored to have you here, Madam Minister. We will have a debate or a conversation that will really span the interests of government and the efforts of government to support the tech space, but you'll have a chance to respond directly to the needs of the private sector. So thank you very much for coming here. Your voice is important. We also have with us Tope Lawane next to me. Tope Lawane is the founder of Helios Investments, which is a very well-known, successful investment firm spanning the entire continent. They're based in London, but they have quite an extensive portfolio across the continent, not only in the tech space, but in infrastructure, energy, and across a variety of sectors. Thank you, Tope, for coming here. Tope is going to open up with some remarks to give kind of the frame for the conversation. We have also Amrote Abdallah from Microsoft. She is running a initiative by Microsoft called the For Africa Initiative, and they're very much involved in supporting SMEs and the rise of young African tech entrepreneurs. Next to Amrote, we have Amadou Tidiane Deme from Partech Ventures, which is a VC firm that just started an Africa fund based in Senegal. And they have had a lot of success, very innovative firm, and they do quite a bit of work in identifying trends and early investments in tech. So thank you very much, Amadou. Silas Adenkule, who is with Reach Robotics. Silas is a young robotics engineer who's made a name for himself in the world at a very young age by creating a fascinating array of robots using kind of combining electrical engineering, mechanics, and artificial intelligence, and he's created something fun. And we're going to have a demonstration of his latest creation. Silas is, I believe, working with Apple right now to develop and distribute some of his creations, and has had quite a bit of success doing so. So thank you very much, Silas, for being here with us. Next to Silas, we have Badr Idrissi from Atlan Space. Atlan Space is another fascinating firm in which they use artificial intelligence to drive drones, autonomous vehicles, in a variety of different applications. One of them being safeguarding the fisheries of African countries. I think you're working extensively in the Seychelles right now. And so there are quite a number of different applications for this technology, and I'm going to give him the opportunity to explain that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I want to give them, really pass the microphone, but I just want to say that over the last few years, Africa's tech has gotten a lot of attention, and if you may know that the large global platform firms look at Africa, and I'm talking about the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Baidus, the Alibabas, the Tencents of the world. They look at Africa for the next billion people. How do we connect the next billion people? And there are a lot of initiatives going on right now in which firms are offering free connectivity. And there's a reason for that to African countries, to people who have never been connected. And the reason is so that they that will someday be able to collect the data and benefit from down the road serving these new customers, these new billion customers on their platforms, and eventually monetizing them. Africa is the last frontier in terms of monetizing platforms. So we know what their plan is. These are multi-trillion-dollar corporations. We know what their plan is, and they see Africa as being central to their growth. The question that I want to ask the panel today is, what is Africa's plan? We're being implicitly from the fact that the plan for these companies to come to Africa is the value of Africa's data. And what is the plan for African entrepreneurs, African governments itself to recognize and identify that value and to translate that into solving problems and to building businesses and job creation and all of the various different applications? I invite you all to talk to the audience today about Africa's agenda, if you will. We know the other's agenda. What is Africa's agenda? Quickly, and this is my last comment, Partech Ventures published a recent report saying that in this last year, African tech startups raised $560 million in 2017. That's a 53% over the year before that. Africa's on track to raise about $1 billion this year. So the rise is real and it's meteoric in terms of the African tech space. But compared to China, it's about $65 billion. So we have a long way to go. And so there's a fast growth, but there's a long way to go. So with that much said, I'll stop and I'll just ask Tope to please kick off talk to me about Helios, yourself, and how you see these issues going forward.
Well, thanks very much, James. Thanks to all of you. Good afternoon, and a special thank you to our host at African Development Bank for putting together such a wonderful and insightful conference, and for inviting me. So I co-founded and manage an investment firm, an Africa-focused private equity investment firm called Helios Investment Partners. We manage between $3.5 and $4 billion of capital, exclusively focused on Africa, and that's managed on behalf of a range of global institutions from the US, Europe, Asia, and to some extent Africa, and indeed we've historically at least counted the AFDB as one of our investors as well. We've invested that capital in about 24 portfolio companies operating across about 40 countries across the continent, so from north to south and east to west, so some fairly extensive coverage. And from a sector standpoint, we're also quite broadly diversified. So we invest in financial services and financial institutions, telecom services and telecom infrastructure, like towers and things of that nature. Consumer goods, food and beverage, consumer services, education, and that kind of thing. But also, power, energy, logistics, distribution, and more, I guess what you would call sort of infrastructure-like investments, but all of them really, frankly, having more of a private equity flavor to them than a traditional infrastructure kind of business. But increasingly, what we're seeing and what we've seen in recent years is that the technological advancements are actually creating some very exciting opportunities in a variety of sectors. Principal amongst them, at least from our perspective, are the payments sector, the financial payments sector, and also e-commerce. And we've invested relatively extensively in those two sectors. So I'll just give you a few examples. We own a company in Nigeria called InterSwitch. InterSwitch processes about 90% of all electronic payments in Nigeria, which is quite meaningful if you consider that it's a country of 170 odd million people, transitioning very quickly from being really a purely cash-based environment to more electronic payments-based environment. So capturing 90% of the processing of electronic transactions in that kind of market is obviously quite an exciting opportunity. We also own a company called Fowry. Fowry is a leading Egyptian payments provider which operates through an agent network of about 60,000 across the country, principally in Cairo and Alexandria, where the population centers are. But again, that's a company that's growing extremely rapidly on the back of similar trends of population growth, demographic growth, technology adoption, and of course a transition from a cash-oriented to a more digital economy. More recently, just in the last month or so, we acquired a company called TPay. TPay is the leading direct carrier billing company in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. Essentially, what TPay does is it enables you and me, for example, to buy digital content on mobile devices, and it's the payment interface that allows you to pay for that, billing it directly to your phone bill, whether you're a prepaid customer or a postpaid customer. And that's again a business that's that's moving, that's growing extremely quickly, not just organically, but also entering into new markets. On the e-commerce side, we own a company called Mall for Africa. Mall for Africa operates an e-commerce marketplace that gives African consumers access to a wide variety of European and American, increasingly Chinese, but primarily European and American e-retailers. And it also provides the tools to enable companies that wish to create similar captive, sort of private marketplaces for their own customers on a software as a service kind of white label basis as well. So I think it was interesting, I think a couple of points that James made earlier around the notion of the generation of data, the capturing of data, and the value of that data. And it's pretty obvious, I would say, from just the description of the companies that I've just provided. And I should have said, in addition to these sectors, we're heavily invested in what I would call the enabling infrastructures, data centers, fiber, all of those things that are, of necessity if those more directly technologically driven businesses are to grow. But in all of these areas, it's pretty clear that you're generating significant amounts of data, that data is valuable in ways that you don't need to be super creative to figure out. But what I would say, though, is that even in businesses that are, that you'd consider as old economy as businesses get, what we're finding is that technology is also helping to drive performance, and in itself, in these old economy businesses, generating, again, interesting data in significant volumes and in monetizable variety. I'll give you, one example there. So we bought from Shell all of their petrol stations across Africa, except for this country. So whenever you're filling your tanks, wherever you are, fill from a Shell petrol station. If you're in South Africa, I don't really care. But that's an old economy business, as old economy as it gets. But what's interesting, obviously, is that retail petrol stations, typically have repeat customers. If the petrol station is near your home, if it's near your office or whatever reason, you tend to have a default petrol station. And so from a pure business perspective, it means that there's value actually to learning more about your core customer, because such a thing actually exists for a petrol station. And so, so what we've started to do is to implement some quite interesting consumer loyalty programs, which are enabling us, to gather, interesting data about the preferences and the identity, in an anonymized way, obviously, of our customers, and therefore position us to serve them a lot better. Now, when you think about the alternative non-core ways, if you will, that kind of data can get monetized, again, anonymized, you're not telling people, you're not giving out data on individuals, but when we've got companies like Burger King and KFC, et cetera, some of the coffee chains seeking to expand their presence across the continent and looking for access to our retail sites, because we've got 2,200 retail sites across the continent, we're able to use that data to give them real insight into the characteristics of that particular site and why the performance of their store or shop or whatever it is that they're seeking to put on the premises will be superior to whatever the alternative site might be. So I think the points that James led with, and the frame that James put around this whole question of yes, technology investing, well, I'm sure we'll dwell much more on that as we go, but also, really what is the data that is being generated, and how might you capture that data, and to what use might you put at that data? And I'm sure there are, there are policy and regulatory issues that surround that, privacy issues, not least of them. But we think that that's really giving rise to some really exciting opportunities. So look forward to talking more about that in the time that we have. But just thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much, Tope. Thank you. Before we move on to the panel, I'd like for our Minister of Science and Technology, Ngubane, to frame a little bit of what the government's role in supporting the initiatives of entrepreneurialism using tech, and how to help companies that need to get out of the lab and into the real world. And if you, Madam Minister, if you could help us understand your efforts and how the government sees this challenge and how you approach it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think firstly for me is to say we're working in partnership not only as South Africa, I'll come to what we are doing in South Africa, but looking at the continent as ministers of science and technology, for example, and focusing around innovation. What is it that we can do for innovation? And the message has been for us, and answering the first question that you asked, we want to see African countries, especially young people in the continent, and us in general being not only consumers of technologies, but also developers of technologies. Because majority of the time you find that we export a lot of technologies. We do not have confidence in the technologies that are developed by our own people in our own continent, and that sometimes creates the challenge. And part of what we've been having conversation is to say, how do we commercialize what has been produced in our countries? How do we make sure that our own people, in what they are producing, we can be able to support it and make sure that we not only import, because in that way, we will be able to create the jobs, we will be able to create new industries, because in technology and innovation, you are able to start new industries, for example, light manufacturing, you are able to see that. And that's what we're looking at. One example in ways that we are trying to collaborate, for example, as South Africa, we built SKA, Meerkat, 64 dishes, locally produced in terms of manufacturing. We're able to deliver that within record time in the SKA area in Carnarvon. And what we have done now is to say, how do we leverage what we have learned as South Africa to other countries? So we've signed with 9 partner countries to say, how do we make sure that we support them? So in terms of skills, but also be able to leverage what we have. Now, in that, we are doing is that we've been able to create a huge center, high data center. We arguing that is the biggest in the world, because in terms of astronomy, the information that you are able to get, the images, in terms of data, that's big data for us. And for us as South Africa to be able to showcase that capacity. But what we have done now, we've gone to various countries, Botswana, Mauritius, Namibia, Ghana, to be able to support them in creating their high-performance computing systems and building them. In that way, we are able to support each other as countries, but also make sure that our young people who are engineers, who are scientists, are able to have space to operate. Part of the areas as well, we said, let's look at infrastructure, not only in South Africa, in the SK area. The 9 partner countries now are looking at potential investors to build infrastructure in the astronomy field, and that's one of the things that we are doing. So that's why we are saying we don't want to see the countries being just consumers of technology, but also developers. In South Africa, part of what we have done, at Science and Technology, our mandate is to be able to support innovators. We look, firstly, we have programs that are called Grassroots Innovators. That program looks at young people who are able to bring any technology that they are saying can be tested and to be working. We take it, we test it if it's a viable idea. Once it's done, then we provide the support until prototype. Yeah. Funding, support, but what has been the challenge for us has been to commercialize the products. So because we are not, as a government, users of this technology, so one of the challenges has been to say, once we finished, these young people have been able to find this technology, develop it as an innovative idea, be able to produce this product till the finishing prototype it, then the issue is the market. And because most of the time, because when you are in innovation space, it becomes difficult because sometimes what you are bringing has never happened, has never existed. So investors, your typical, for example, financing institutions, do not believe in such ideas because they want to see something that is less risk, something that is not there, that has been tested, and with innovation it doesn't. So part of what we are trying to do as African countries to look at, obviously it's a global problem, not only for us as African countries. It's how do we ensure that we create financial institutions that can be able to support innovation. And we believe in terms of economic development, growth, for Africa to see its tragedy in a positive way, economy growing, innovation has to be in the center. As I said, the days of big factories, the days of big manufacturing is coming to an end. Light manufacturing is the future. So the small SMMEs who are able to produce new ideas, bring technologies and create new industries are going to be the ones that create jobs for us. So the discussion is to say, how do we ensure that there is financial support? Obviously, as governments, the financial ability to support some of these programs are limited because obviously we have other competing priorities in terms of services. Now, how do we partner with institutions that are able to acknowledge new innovative areas, new ideas, so that they remove the barriers that are hindering? I know quite a number of entrepreneurs can share stories how it was difficult to take an idea, sell it, and have somebody saying, I can invest. So those are some of the issues. Now, coming to what we want to see, obviously a lot of interest is in our continent. Now we think we are the future. And I think what we need to do as African countries and what we have to offer is, one, the youth bulge that we have, because that is the future. Many global countries are battling because you have aging population. We have a population that is young, that is able to carry us into the future. People talk about the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution, if you talk about even technology, young people are more adaptable to technology, are able to utilize technology to solve certain areas. And we've been saying, let's not look at technology in a manner that many in the labor sector would say is destroying jobs. How do we pass the message positively onto the continent to say that we can be able to utilize the growth of technology to be able to create new jobs, create new markets, but create new entrepreneurs and provide support for them. So yes, there are still a lot of gaps. There are a lot of discussions that we are having, but I think when we partner, when we work together, hence the platforms like this where you're bringing business and government together, we are able to see how we can leverage from each other and be able to build sustainable partnership.
Thank you very much. That goes quite a ways to answering the question of what is the agenda, but also it speaks, I think, to the entrepreneurs who are around on this panel who also will be in need of government to support new concepts to get them out the door. So thank you. I'd like to move next to Amrote, and if you could just tell us briefly what you are doing at For Africa and how Microsoft, and I didn't mean to in any way paint the big companies such as Microsoft in a negative light in terms of Africa. I know you're involved in solution building as well. So please let us know briefly how, what your efforts are in that.
Excellent. Thank you, James. I think just in conscious of time, I'll briefly describe what we've been doing for the last 6 years, specifically as it relates to how do you tap into the growth opportunities across Africa? And that is very much related to sort of where technology is headed today, whether you're talking about data, AI, and sort of the transformation of all our industries. We've been investing very much at the infrastructure, and allow me to go a little bit deep into that. One is the hard infrastructure, talk about connectivity. We were the first ones to launch TV white spaces technology across about 16 of them today, and the Kenya being the first one. And that's very much at the core of how do you actually lay the backbone that would allow for any of the discussions that we're having today and that we've had over the last few years on how we take technology in Africa to the next space. The second piece is around the soft infrastructure, which is skills building. And I don't think today we talk enough about what is it that it takes for us to be able to drive the right talent, the right know-how, the right experience for graduates who are coming to the workforce to know what they're getting into. But more importantly, how do you utilize them and make them an asset beyond just the volume number of the youth bulge across Africa, but make them actually a monetizable key asset that companies, private or public, can actually tap into. That's the second piece. And so to that fact, we've trained slightly over 800,000 youth over the last 6 years. And that is just tapping into some of the few markets that we've been driving that in. The second one is, I think, you know, and as the minister mentioned, is around hard infrastructure and coming back to data infrastructure. We announced last year that we're investing in 2 data centers in Africa, one in Johannesburg and one in Cape Town. But that's just the beginning of it. So you, I think, asked earlier around, you know, is data sort of the thing that's driving all our interest across Africa? The answer is yes and no. It's, you know, Silicon Valley doesn't need Africa. And I think we have to be clear on that. It's how do we actually tap into some of the new technologies to advance our own agenda in Africa to drive to the next level of development. So I think I'll stop with that, and I think we can go into other discussions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Tijan, if you could introduce yourself and just briefly tell us a little bit about Partech. And what we want to get to a kind of a debate in a few minutes, just to open it up a little bit. So if we could, we'll have an opportunity as well to go into further detail during the debate.
Okay. Thank you, James. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
This is actually an interesting setup for a question that is very wide, and for which I like the frame you put on it, which is if we're going to discuss Africa's tech and how to take it to the next level, it's interesting to set that question in the frame of what's going on the global stage with the big players, as well as what, as governments and private leaders, we want to set as an agenda for Africa in this. We all come at this from a very specific angle. From myself, having been in Africa a tech entrepreneur, having worked for Google in Africa, for one of these big giants, after a few years, one of the obvious missing pieces for whatever we want to do with tech in Africa was that we needed, on one hand, we had a growing reservoir of top entrepreneurial talent on the continent. And we're talking here about entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs on the ground, tech entrepreneurs abroad, like Silas here, or young people from everywhere in the world flocking onto certain places in Africa to solve big problems. And the opportunities they had to solve some very foundational economical issues, like using technology. What Tope was mentioning about financial services is an example, or what these startups are doing about energy in the off-grid space are examples of these specific emerging market problems that we felt entrepreneurs could address with technology and build something meaningful for Africa and big regional business champions. While we were seeing some of these emerge and get funding on a large scale, at Partech we felt that there are still a few missing blocks within the whole investment ecosystem, and that we could address maybe one of those. And again, we must stretch out that there is no single silver bullet in here. So Partech Africa Fund that we launched and announced in January this year is a 120 million euro fund that focuses on early stage Series A, Series B startups, meaning investing $1 to $6 million in startups that have started working on one of these problems, have given it a shot, a real shot, have started seeing some traction in a country, and where we can come in and help scale it in a country and across the region. Mm-hmm. And just to tie it down to what is at stake here, what is really exciting about working in this space right now is seeing, for instance, how some of these startups are addressing not only SME issues, but going down the segments into the informal sector, mm-hmm. and enabling all of these informal professionals across the continent to do business and do better business. Right. I want to call out, for instance, we invested in South Africa actually recently in Yoko, a startup that allows merchants, any small merchant, to accept card payments in a country where a significant majority of adults now can own cards. It is still very exceptional to find a small merchant that can accept payments. And bridging this kind of gaps is something you can do when you leverage technology, but also build solid operations and a good business. We invested also, for instance, in Nigeria in Trade Depot, a company that is enabling informal retail players to place orders digitally and get delivered in 24 hours. The informal retail sector in Africa is anywhere, depending on who's talking, from 80 to 95% of retail in Africa. It's a $1 trillion business that today faces a lot of inefficiencies, and having a digital platform bringing all the players together and allow them to do business in an efficient way is what ultimately this is all about. So just my short answer to your bigger question, despite having been on the other side of the fence with one of the big players, it feels to me like there are these big specific problems that can only be solved by entrepreneurs on the ground, addressing it from a very local context. But that when they solve it, they're on a path to build big regional players at least, and they actually on a path to address problems for emerging markets, which ultimately is most of the world today. So I'm very optimistic.
Thank you. I'm going to actually skip over Silas, and it'll become clear why I do this in a second, and go to Badr, who's going to tell us a little bit about Atlan Space, and introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Badr Idrisi, co-founder of Atlan Space, and I would like to start with how our journey started. We found out a very shocking fact. $2.3 billion is what illegal fishing is costing West Africa every year, destroying 300,000 jobs, only because our countries in West Africa are not able to monitor what's happening in the ocean. So we decided to act. We developed an artificial intelligence that can allow drones, the big drones, to fly autonomously and monitor what's happening in the ocean, monitoring, understanding what's happening, and notifying the authorities. We soon found out that the fact that what's happening in big areas is not only a problem that is causing illegal fishing, it's also poaching, deforestation, and so many other problems in environmental crime. So our framework technology is allowing government and institutions to monitor very large geographical areas, understand what's happening there, and take the best course of action to mitigate the risk. Today we're on the project in the Seychelles, helping the government of Seychelles to fight illegal fishing. The project is sponsored by the National Geographic Society. And we are also, with the support of the African Development Bank, discussing with one of the biggest countries in Africa on how they can use our technology to provide small farmers that represents more than 70% of the farmers in Africa having less than 5 hectares. How can these small farmers benefit from precision agriculture? And this is what we're working on.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. And we'll have a chance to go into it when we move to the discussion afterwards. Silas, you come to us from London, and you are a robotics engineer, and you've created a very fascinating company that ties together these issues of data, the importance of data, the importance of using that data to interact with people. And if you could just tell us a little bit about how what you have created you feel speaks to the challenges and opportunities of Africa Tech, and just show us what you do.
Yeah, but before I speak, I guess I'll show what the robot does, and then I'll talk a bit about my story, and then give my opinion on kind of the topic that we're discussing as well. Because I'm sure everybody's wondering. So I'll just turn the robot on, and I'll give a little description of what it is. So while I let the robot come to life, this is Mechamon, short for Mechanical Monster. The name is a play of things like, Pokemon, Pocket Monster. So this is the first time the robot is waking up, finding its feet in the world, so to say. And it's a legged robot, a legged robotic platform, obviously. We are currently deploying it at the intersection of robotics, gaming, and augmented reality. But you've got other areas that we're starting to look into as well. The primary one is education. It's already being used in education. We're also starting to look into more traditional industrial uses as well. You control the robots via an app on your smartphone or tablet. So I'm just going to connect to it. It will be obvious when the connection is successful, because we'll do a little hello world, a little wave at everybody. It's unfortunate I can't show you everything that's happening on my phone. There's an interface here, world that you're stepping into. I can control the robot from my smartphone, show the different capabilities that it has. I can play with it using augmented reality. The robot is agile enough to flip itself over and right itself again. So it's really, really an interesting phenomenal robotics platform in itself. In terms of my story, I was born in Nigeria, was there. Thank you. In terms of my story, I was born, it will fall asleep eventually, so I can kind of leave it there. I was born in Nigeria, moved to the UK when I was about 11. I grew up around science and technology. My dad was a biochemistry teacher. My mom was a medical nurse and a midwife. So from a young age, I had that opportunity to have that interest. And it's really important to note that, because it wasn't because of when I moved to the UK that the interest was there. It was already there from the kind of Nigerian ecosystem. But I think in terms of the entrepreneurial journey, the ecosystem or the lessons I've learned from there are lots of things that can be taken and implemented to help make the journey easier for entrepreneurs here. So during my undergraduate studies, I studied robotics, started going into schools, trying to get more young people interested in STEM, even in the UK, in sciences, in technology and engineering and maths. And I saw that when you bring traditional kind of gaming principles into the classes, more young people were interested, they were more engaged. And if anecdotally, a lot of the best developers that I know today, they had their interest peaked at a young age, either through gaming or something that was creative, something that captured their imagination. I think that's really important, at least exposure to it at a young age. Because when you capture imagination, then you have curiosity, and then people can start to dig into things themselves and start to learn themselves. I think that's really, really important. And off the back of that, I saw an opportunity to start a company that could do that. So started a company during my penultimate year of my undergraduate studies. We've been going for about 5 years now. Started distribution late last year with Apple. So we're distributing in the UK, the US, Europe with Apple. I go back to Nigeria quite often. I've still got family there. And there's a lot. I think if you look around you, there are lots of people at this event. We're talking about tech, and if you look around you, the room isn't quite packed, right? I think in Africa, we still have a long way to go in terms of the demystifying of tech, the interest in tech, the implementation of it, the understanding of the impact that it can have. I've seen a lot of talk in terms of the traditional kind of industries, the infrastructure. In the long term, and then now talking about the data, the point on data, technology can not only complement those industries, it can make them more efficient, it can make them better. But if we're running a race here and we're trying to play catch up, we can't look at the heels of the other people in the race. We have to look at the end goal as well. So if in the next by 2050, if Africa is going to more than double in population, you're going to have 1 billion young people. A lot of the big data companies are looking at Africa as consumers, as food, right? If we don't want them all to be consumers, and if we look at the traditional industries and we say, well, at least they can be laborers, where is the creation happening? Where is the creativity happening? And if that's not happening with tech, then you're always going to be running a losing race. So I think that then brings you to the solution, which is if you focus on the young people, and we work hard to try and make sure that STEM education, which a lot of countries have already realized and starting to work on, and I'm echoing this, but STEM education, and especially I think robotics as a platform to teach the principles of STEM education is really, really important. I think that might be a gateway to try and start to nurture the young population to be positioned to have a better future. It's a responsibility that I put on myself and on our company right from the start, that we're not just going to make a product that entertains, it would also inspire and educate people. With this robot, for example, we wanted a gateway for people, so you can mold the legs, you know, a bit like stop motion animation. You can chain actions together and start to learn the principle of coding without actually coding. If you're then interested, you can go to the next level and learn to code and start to do hardcore programming. And you know, if we start to take more of those types of steps, those types of implementation, I think we'll see something interesting happening. So you know, from myself personally, I'd love to be able to work with governments and companies here in Africa to start to take the technology that we're building and start to distribute them and implement them to support the youths of Africa in their STEM education learning as well. So that's a little of my background and what we're working on, and I'm sure there's a lot more interesting stuff that we can discuss as well.
Thanks a lot for that. Thanks for the demonstration too. That's pretty cool. So a lot of you have made remarks about you know, data and how the data can be a tool to be used to empower SMEs or to empower startups. And what I'm wondering is how can we get the public, policymakers, investors focused on the inherent value of Africa's yet to be collected and monetized data? What's the best way to perhaps giving examples of how unintended solutions can be found by looking at data that is being generated by startups? I just want to throw that out there. Badr, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, so, sorry. Something really fascinating happened, I believe last March or May. There was an Afro-American student in MIT that was testing a facial recognition AI system. And as she was Afro-American, the AI didn't recognize her. The AI was only recognizing white people, not Afro-American. This fact is only meaning that if we don't start gathering data as Africans now, we will be left behind in the fourth industrial revolution. This is really a dramatic fact. If we don't start now, we'll not, I mean, we're already behind what's happening in other countries, developed countries, and we'll be left behind really far if we don't start gathering our own data that is really specific to Africa, that is happening here. So one of the things that we're doing in Atlant Space, so when we're flying over, for example, understanding what's happening in illegal fishing, we are also analyzing the trends. And one NGO came discussing with us saying, yeah, but when you start flying, you go from the shore and then go to the ocean. And it happens that you may go over, for example, wetlands. Right. And with climate change, we may be interested to understand the trends of wetlands, of what's happening in the coastal areas. So this data can be generated not as a primary objective, but as a secondary objective of the first mission, that is fighting illegal fishing.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a great answer. There are a few people who want to chime in. I think we're going to start with Tope, Madam Minister, and then Silas wanted to talk. Tope.
Sure, and I'll keep it
quick.
Yeah, exactly. No, look, what we're particularly interested in, obviously, is we're in the investment business, and one of the significant barriers to actually making an investment in African companies, or whether you're starting a new business or trying to expand an existing one, is just actually knowing, for example, what is the addressable market, like how big is this market? So you have that fact, meaning it's just a barrier to investing generally in the continent, against the other barrier, which is that, you know, typically in developed markets, you know, the government or public sector entities have a lot of data that they publish on websites, etc. But African governments, you know, have limited budgets and competing priorities, as the Honorable Minister pointed out. And it seems to me actually that there is a very easy way and cheap way for governments to, you know, to improve their ability to provide data without actually having to pay for it themselves, and to facilitate the making of investments by people like us. So for example, you know, there are lots of, it used to be that when you had to conduct, we were trying to invest in a low-cost airline in West Africa several years ago, and just trying to figure out how many people actually travel, for example, Lagos to Accra. Well, you know how many people fly, but you don't know how many people take, you know, public transport and buses, etc. And so we literally had people at the border in Aflao. We had people at the border in Cote d'Ivoire, literally with a clipboard, actually counting. Well, today, you can do survey data pretty much instantaneously. In 24 hours, we could get you 90% accuracy on that answer. But, you know, you have to know where to look. Whereas I think if the public sector sort of created, I have no idea exactly how, repositories of data to which people would contribute and get compensated, if you will, in some fashion, I think it could really open up a lot of investment opportunities. The economies here are much bigger than people actually realize, but you can't put your hand on how big the economy is.
And so collecting data from non-traditional sources can help you measure.
Which is much cheaper to do now than it ever was.
Absolutely. Madam Minister, please chime in on this.
No, definitely. I think what he's saying is quite important, but I think what we need to look at it as well as an opportunity. Yes, for me, it's an opportunity gap. The fact that Africa still has to do so much creates an opportunity for those who are coming, those global companies that still want to develop, that still, for example, if you're looking at other platforms such as Google, they might be popular everywhere else, and you still have a fair share market in Africa that do not have access. Now, that's why I always say, when you look at such things, maybe, yes, we've been behind in a number of things, but for those who are entrepreneurs, for those who are companies, for those who are businesses, it's an opportunity gap that you should be able to say, how do we help? Either through gathering of data, find a mechanism to say, okay, governments, let's help you to find developing of data. Obviously, in South Africa, we might be far better compared to other countries in terms of gathering data, but we still have challenges, as the colleague was saying, artificial intelligence, whereby you can't recognize the face. Similarly, there was a time where South Africans had a campaign, hashtag, my name is not a mistake, because when you type Mamoloko or Kensani on Google, it underlines it as if it's a mistake. Therefore, how do we utilize that as an opportunity to be able to say, okay, this market is untapped, let me get into it and invest into it. So this is while we're seeing in terms of infrastructure, even in data, in technology, it's an opportunity gap that many can invest in and see this in going forward. In markets that are already developed, you can't, they're saturated. Here in Africa, it's markets that you can utilize.
Thank you. Thank you. Silas, you wanted to say something on this topic?
Yeah, on this particular topic, I'm not a politician, so I don't have domain expertise on policy making. We talked about this just outside, which was, if you need convincing on the value of data, you just look at the top 10 most valuable company in the world, and the majority of them don't own as many physical assets as, say, United Airlines or something like that, but they're, 3-point-something trillion in total worth. So, from a government's point of view, or in terms of advice to the policymaker, the US, for example, or China, for example, they have policies in place to try and support their local companies or companies in the local market. In the same way as you were mentioning, Africa doesn't need saving, and no one's going to come and save Africa. It's going to be us building things for Africa, building businesses in Africa. And, and again, what is the power of data? Data, from a selfish point of view, for a business, tries to help the business to be better, to be more efficient. So if you're a software as a service type of company, you can narrow your audience better. If you're doing ads, you can target your audiences better. As a byproduct, you end up collecting a lot of data. And then that data can then be used, as you mentioned before, that network effect. It's a butterfly type of effect. That data can then be used in other types of industries, but you have the data. So in a way, by supporting early stage startups, by nurturing high-tech startups and allowing them to grow, startups that are working in fields that use data, otherwise the government has the burden on its shoulder to try to do this by itself, whereas you could just support entrepreneurship, and the companies, you'll have 100 companies in your ecosystem that are all collecting data, still inside the country, still inside the ecosystem. The challenge then is, how do you try to nurture, entrepreneurship? And as you mentioned before, there's a gap, there's a funding gap, and all because it's high risk, right? So things that can be done are things like incubators, accelerators, filling in those small gaps to just make it easier to take the first step. So that's my take on it if I'm looking at it from the entrepreneurship type of lens.
That's a valuable contribution. Now, the next question that I would think of is, okay, we've established the value of data, and it's really kind of it's a rhetorical question because we know it's the essence of the intangible value of these huge multi-trillion-dollar companies, and Africa's data is yet to be accounted for. So one could argue, billions and billions and billions of dollars of value waiting to be measured and collected and exploited by Africans themselves. Question I have for you, Tijan and Amrot, is how can technology lower the barrier? How can the data and technology that produces the data lower the barrier to enable SMEs to be established and to thrive?
Okay, it's ladies first normally. Actually, this gives me an opportunity to come back to a very prosaic, I think, example. I mentioned earlier how retail is an informal space, mostly. If you take a big brand in Nigeria, the typical setup will be they'll have 100 big distributors they work with in the country who supply to a few thousand warehouses, informal wholesalers, who supply anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million shops on the streets that are selling that brand. And if you look at the data flow in this space, for now, it's completely hidden, but the brand, once they've given the product to the big distributors, have no idea where the product goes, how it is consumed, which retailer buys how much. The wholesaler picks, because they don't know any day what will be the amount of product that anybody will buy, will put a lot in trucks and do van sales. They'll drive around. Monday, they'll do this part of the city. Tuesday, another part. And they go back to the warehouse every day with half of the van full, which accounts, from a study I looked at, for 5% of the cost of the retail products. And then the retailer, think about this guy. He's running, so they're running, again, 95% of retail in Africa. They cannot have access to credit. They don't have bank accounts. They're doing business day in, day out. Nobody knows what amount of business they do. Nobody will lend them money. They have to wait every day for that truck to come by because they're not connected to these people to make requests. So bottom line, if today you digitize that whole supply chain, many things would happen all of a sudden. The retailer would have access to credit because the financial institutions on the ground want to do credit. They just need the data to de-risk the credit or to at least control the risk. So they'll get access to credit. They'll expand their businesses. They'll open more shops. As one of the ladies who's running a shop was telling me, I have capacity to run 10 shops. Give me money. So they'll open more shops. And the best one of them will flourish. The wholesaler will have better logistics. Products will be cheaper. The brand will know what's going on, will be able to push promotions tailored to each of the areas. Everybody will be able to do better business, and ultimately, consumers will benefit and our businesses will benefit. I could go on this forever. I'm a big believer in the transformative power of data. And the good news is it's happening. For instance, in Kenya this year, a company called M-Survey raised money doing on the surveys, providing data to businesses. So the fact that this is being seen as opportunities that investors are putting money in is also a very good signal.
So,
sorry, if I may just quickly add. Look, I think that there's some work that we need to do in demystifying data. Right? We talk about data, but data for what? What kind of data? Data is a tool that anyone can use to actually make for public policy and for decision makers to have more insight. Whether you're at a national level, whether you're at a county level. For businesses, the same. So I think there's an element of understanding as we talk about data, big data, what kind of data are we talking about collecting and what is it being used for? So there's one piece of that. And the second one I think that you mentioned, and a colleague of mine said this to me once, is around data. If you pay for it, you own it. And if it's free, they own it, right? So as we talk about sort of what is it that we use it for and how we actually approach it, we also have to be clear about what our agenda is and how we approach it and how we utilize it and how we also make it available as well.
I like what you just said. If you pay for it, you own it. If it's free, you owe it. And that's kind of a timely reminder of free connectivity being offered by a lot of companies. We're running out of time, but I guess I want to collapse the last few questions into I guess really kind of one of the more essential questions. Before the session started, and even during the session, we talked about the rise of tech investments in Africa this year being at about 500 million, next year being perhaps $1 billion, compared to China, for example, at 65 billion. The population of Africa is over 1 billion people, so there's a lot of unabsorbed capacity. So the question is, are there constraints? We hear a lot about, well, Africa can't absorb capital. There's not enough deals for the capital available. It's impossible for the sector to absorb the investment that is needed. Do you believe that? And if you don't believe that, what are some of the strategies for financing and the opportunities, the hotter and the kind of the future opportunities that you see driving Africa's tech to the next level? Tope, I'll ask you to go really quickly on that, and then I'll go down the line, and then we can.
Sure.
I don't know if there's an ability to take questions or if we have to stop there, but I'm certainly open to it.
Sure. Well, the quick answer is I don't believe it. I do think that Africa has the capacity to absorb significantly more capital. I think part of it is a bit of an optical illusion. I think what you see in the U.S. and there are basically only 2 places in the world where the platforms themselves can get built. Building a platform is extremely expensive and requires having a large domestic market to monetize. That's why the platforms, Google, Facebook, etc., come out of either China or the US. They don't come out of anywhere else. And so, but to build those, so the billions of dollars that you read about being invested in places like China and in the US are going to platform development. So they're sustaining companies that are losing literally billions of dollars every year until they get to sort of, to some kind of steady state or self-funding state. In Africa, I think, we don't need to worry about $60 billion per year because we're not investing in global platforms. We're investing in applications, companies that take advantage of existing platforms to do the interesting things. You don't need to have invested Google Maps to invest sort of to build a ride-sharing company that takes advantage of Google Maps, and there's a very different sort of cost element there. So I think that I wouldn't compare the 60 to the 70 and say we're so far behind. I think the gap is a bit closer. But the main constraint that I see, and I appreciate that I'm taking up all the time that's allotted, but the main constraint that I see is that investing in innovation, unfortunately, is an amalgamation of differently situated investors taking different pieces of risk. And so the investor that's prepared to invest the first dollar demands a much higher return, but just in species, that investor is different from the one that invests maybe the last dollar that's prepared to take a lower return. But because you don't have the ecosystem of each of these kinds of investors along the way, it's hard for those, like Tijan, who are in the business of investing the first dollar, to do it without real visibility as to where the second, third, and final dollar will come from. And it's hard for those who like to invest the last or later dollars to find things to invest in if the Tijans of this world haven't already created them. So I think there's some constraints there, but I don't think that we are quite as far back.
We're nowhere near capacity.
Yeah.
Tijan, I want to throw this to you as well as the other investor on the panel. Do you buy this notion that it's difficult for projects to absorb capital?
No, of course not. I think we can absorb a lot more capital, provided that we do 2 things. We should work on getting alternative in financing mechanisms that can be comfortable with the risk associated with this kind of capital, as Tope was calling out. And we also need to build the first stage of the funnel. I think our ability to develop angel and seed investment will be key in building the whole value chain so that we can absorb bigger amounts at the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's a very good answer. Did you want to say something about it?
Yeah, so actually what I would like to add is that in addition to the fact that entrepreneurs in Africa need financing, but there is another way, there could be another model for Africa which is more partnership than pure financing. For example, this was the case for us. At the beginning, we were looking for VCs to invest in us, but as we're doing something they would think that is too risky, B2B, B2G business, we started looking what would be the value of the money that we're looking for. What would we do with this money? And we figured out that it would be infrastructure. So we were helped by Microsoft having their database to be used. We were helped by United Nations accessing customers and building partnership in that. With NGOs, African Development Bank. So building partnership can be a solution to mitigate the need for money, pure money.
Okay. So it's a multifactorial approach. You have to take it in steps. I think we were talking a little bit about the strategy of effectuation.
Exactly.
Using the resources that you have, not necessarily saying, there's my goal, let me back down from the goal and chart my course from there. But use what you have and get to the next step. We have to unfortunately wrap up here. And it doesn't look like there are any microphones available to take questions, unfortunately. But, is there? Okay, great. Do we have questions?
There is a question here.
Yeah? Well, while we're waiting for the microphone, Silas, we've talked a little bit about, and I've read a little bit about what you're doing. And what we're looking at is not just a robot. What it is a platform that interacts with people in various ways and provides a benefit. And I want to read a quotation of something that you said recently in an interview and ask you a question based upon that while we wait. Oh, microphone's here? Okay, we'll get to that and we'll close with that.
Okay.
Fine. Are there any questions?
Questions?
Sure. Could we? Right here? Okay, and then we'll go to you, man. Oh, no? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Moses Akwa, representing Young Innovators and the founder of AfroLink. I'm actually happy to see a great panel, but I'm sad to see the whole auditorium empty. And again, we are talking about the next future, the next big thing. Technology is an enabler to actually make all these investments become traceable and become more efficient. And I'm actually sad to see that this whole room is a bit empty. My question is that, thank you. My question is, how do we make this whole thinking that technology is something for some strange people and not for the normal beings? How do we bring it back to the normal, everyday thinker? All the investors should have been here looking at how they can actually speed up this whole investment. We are talking about transaction. But truly, what happens is that it is so slow that Africa is still behind. How do we transform that? How do we change this mindset and make it work?
So I think everyone wants to talk to that one. Here's what I would like to do. I would like to maybe start with you, Amrote, and then I'd like to also hear from the minister, because I think what we're hearing that it's too slow. And what can we do to speed this up? And maybe...
I think just to maybe answer Moses' question. Look, the auditorium is empty. I would like to think that we're all very interesting, but here's the truth to it. If you had Jack Ma sort of be here and talk about sort of his success, about Alibaba, where and how it started, I think the auditorium would be in a slightly different structure right now. What we're missing is the champions. What we're missing is creating those who can actually showcase around what is possible to create in Africa. We have those from other industries. I think there are a number of them this morning on this panel to talk about it. But once we're able to establish the success stories, I think how this session in the future will be structured will be very differently.
Madam Minister, if you want to add something.
I don't think we're missing the champions necessarily. We're not celebrating our champions.
We're not celebrating our champions.
We're not celebrating our champions.
Yes.
We have people who are doing very well.
Many of whom are on the stage.
Yes, but we're not celebrating them. And this is what I made earlier on, to say it's even in technology. because we're not confident to utilize what we are producing. So if we can be confident as Africans to say when we produce something, we can believe it's good enough for us to use it, not that somebody else has to produce something and bring it. And just to come to the point that you raised earlier on, in terms of technology, why sometimes it's late, it's in two ways. One, it's not only from the side of investors, but even from the side of governments and society, where there's lack of trust. And I think we're starting to break those barriers. And that has been caused, for example, by issues such as dumping of technology. And I'll speak from a policy point of view, where you'd find that when you open the market, and I'll make an example of analog and digital TVs, where because South Africa and other African countries were late in migrating, and therefore you found that in markets where digital televisions were already in place, and they no longer had a use for analog TVs. Therefore, the analog TVs were brought here.
Yes.
So, and that creates
Obsoletes.
that creates mistrust. Even in other technologies, you find such happens. And once it happens like that, it creates mistrust between governments and the users and the importers of technology. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, so that when we look at building and breaking down the barriers, these are some of the issues that we have to be able to address.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
It looks like Silas and Bada both wanted a shot at this question.
Yeah.
Can you keep it to like a minute? And then
Yeah,
I'd like to move on to another question.
Very quickly, I think that there is, for the policymakers, entrepreneurship and innovation is more there to solve the unemployment problem rather than solving the real issues and challenges that countries are facing. And we can see this when, for example, when a country is having a problem, he doesn't go and try to solve it, to ask the entrepreneurs to solve it for them, but more go to the big companies and try to find a ready solution for the problem they already have.
Okay. Silas.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what everyone has said. I think one other perspective to it is, you know, people like Jack Ma, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, they are sometimes outliers, you know. You're looking at 1,000x returns, right? When investors see returns, you know, a lot of businesses fail, but when investors see returns, a lot of them are, you know, if you're lucky, 4x, 5x. I'm sure probably the majority, if you look at the, you know, the distribution, are on the low, but at least you're still seeing returns. I think the ecosystem is still slightly premature in terms of, and this is back to that capital discussion as well, as the ecosystem ready to absorb the capital. I think it can absorb it over the appropriate period of time, because it's not just the financial structure that you need. You need founders that have built companies to be able to mentor the ones that are coming up at the different stages of the ladder. So I think what that then puts responsibility a bit on the government, while still, and I appreciate a huge amount of work to solve current problems, to also be future thinking, to put some catalyst into that ecosystem. That catalyst sometimes comes in the form of, you know, accelerators, incubators again, or mandating larger companies that are, you know, well established and profiting to create something for the ecosystem, to create that nurturing. But I think a catalyst is needed when you recognize that there is a deficit, you know, in the ecosystem.
Thank you. Let's get to another question. Here, then here. I promise.
Okay, my name is Solomon Quaino, and I've been with the IFC, and I just recently left the IFC. My question is going to come out really from a development angle. I was never interested in infrastructure as an asset class in itself. I was more interested in infrastructure because if infrastructure is working well, there's great economic development, growth.
Could you speak up just a little bit, please?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is going to come out really from a development angle, and it's directed to the Honorable Minister of Science and Technology. Okay. So infrastructure as an asset class was never interesting in itself. It's more because if you have properly working infrastructure, you have greater economic development. Likewise, one is not necessarily interested in technology by itself, but one is interested in technology as a disruptor to create financial inclusion so that more financial services go to people towards the base of the pyramid so we can actually have increased economic development. The biggest resistance to such innovation in the technology space to enable financial inclusion comes from lobbies in the traditional businesses. So an example would be the banking sector in some countries. And unfortunately, the regulators tend to be influenced by these parties. So my question to the Honorable Minister, you cannot regulate innovation. You've got to really let innovation percolate, and maybe at the time in which it becomes big and clearer is when you put in the right safeguards. So what is it that you could be doing more of to allow technology to really disrupt a lot of traditional activities across Africa so that we can have greater financial inclusion, which would lead to more economic development and also less poverty?
Okay, thank you for that. The question is, if I understand, how can we allow disruption? How can we enable disruption, I suppose? And I think that's what we're all sitting here for, is to promote disruption. Unfortunately, I've been told that we do need to wrap up because the next session is here. So this will have to be our last question. Then I'll ask one final question can I close this down? Is there anyone on the panel who wants to take that? Madam Minister.
No, thanks. I think the issue of disruption and the issue of technology and regulation, all of us are battling with it across the globe. I mean, you would have seen what World Bank and IMF started looking at how to deal with cryptocurrency. It's a typical example because we've been in an environment where we've used to creating regulations. So all of us have to adapt. It's not something that can happen overnight. But the issue is, how do we deal with consequences later? I mean, the issue of self-driving cars, who do you hold liable when the car has bumped into somebody? You know, such things. As we deal with the disruption, as we deal with those, we'll obviously learn over time. There is no way that you can say, I can definitely regulate technology. Any politician or policymaker can say that we've definitely been able to regulate technology, innovation, disruption, would be lying. It's something that we are learning over time, and it improves. The issue is to say, how do we kill the barriers so that innovation can happen? Okay. And that's what we'll have to battle with and work together, all of us, to be able to do.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Before I move on to the closing statement, I just want to see if I can get another financier to respond to that. Tijan, do you have anything to say about promoting or financing or encouraging disruption?
So
it's going to have to be literally 15 seconds.
Again, in one word, we need to get out there very early stage risk, people with appetite for risk, to invest in early stage startups. I think this is where policymakers can really play a role in enabling a new generation of African fund managers doing this. It would be a great way to drive out private investment and create what governments care about, jobs.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to end there, unfortunately. There's a lot more to say, and all of the panel, I guess, will be available to meet with the audience. Thank you very much for coming and participating. I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank the Honorable Minister and the African Development Bank for having us on. Thank you very much.